about 2 minutes. There are 2 links in the description. One is the prompt. If you were with us yesterday, you probably already know it. If not, you might want to pull it up and read the passage. And then the second is a handout that we'll be utilizing today and as part of your practice. So we'll get started again in about 1.5 minutes now. But if you want to go ahead and open the links, that'd be great. Hello, for those of you just tuning in, there are 2 links in the description. If you want to go ahead and open those. One is the prompt that we looked at from yesterday. You might just open it, do a quick skim, reacquaint yourself with the text. And the second is a handout we'll be using today. So we'll get started in about 30 seconds as soon as the clock ticks over. But if you want to go ahead and open those links, that might make things easier later. All right, it is officially start time. Hello, good to see some of you again. If you were here yesterday, good to see you again. If you're joining us today for the first time, nice to have you. Welcome to our AP English Language online sessions. We're talking primarily about how an argument demonstrates understanding of an audience's beliefs, values, or needs. But before we get into that, I wanted to introduce myself first. I'm Mrs. Velitis. I am an AP English language teacher in Naperville, Illinois, Naperville North High School. It's about an hour or so outside of Chicago, and today is a terrible, dreary, depressing day, lots of rain. It's not as nice as it was yesterday, so I hope wherever you are, it's sunny and warm and you're enjoying your time. All right, before we get started too much, I do want to provide just a brief overview of what is happening over the next month with these online classes. This might be a little redundant for those of you who were here yesterday, but I think it bears repeating that we're really covering units 8 and 9 from March 25th to April 7th. And you might be saying, I heard that units 8 and 9 are not being assessed. And that is true. They won't be explicitly assessed, but our course is one where the skills really build upon each other, and units 8 and 9 are about really honing and developing your craft as a reader, a writer, and a thinker. So even though you won't necessarily have test questions about any of the content from 8 and 9, those skills will help you for the exam. Think of this as it's a continuation of your learning. So I know a lot of you are not in school, but this is what you might be covering if you were in your classes. We are going to look at it through the lens of the sophistication point more over the next week and a half, because that's what we keep hearing from our students that they want more help with. So we are going to be looking at that. I also want to hopefully not deflate your hopes too much, but I don't have insight either into what you will see on the AP exam. I know I had a few students find my email address yesterday and ask, does this mean we will have a rhetorical analysis? I don't know that information either. Instead, try to again see these as though we're addressing key skills. It's not meant to be exam prep because I don't know what type of question or what the free response that you'll see, I don't know what that will include. So think of this as we're trying to hit some of those key skills that are important regardless of what you would see for your free response question. Then starting April 8th, we'll move into review sessions. About a week and a half from now, College Board will release a series of topics that we'll be covering. These will be more in isolation. So the next week and a half or so, they'll build upon each other. But starting April 8th, those will just be isolated topics so you can tune in or out depending on what you need. And just to give you a review, some might be things like introducing and embedding evidence, or something like understanding the line of reasoning. So you could peruse those topics and figure out what is something that you know you need more help with. And we'd love to have you back on those days. All right, so just to catch you up on what we did yesterday, So for those of you who tuned in, this will be review. For those of you who are new, it'll just be good information so you know how to move forward with our lesson today. We started by looking at the sophistication point and why it's such a challenging point for students to earn. Primarily because, as you can see here on the left-hand side, that a lot of times students might try to contextualize, they might try to address the rhetorical situation in their analysis or throughout their essay, but it usually comes across as a broad, generic, sweeping generalization. It's not complex. And while there are 3 ways you could earn the sophistication point, we're really looking at that first one and how you should be exploring the significance or relevance of rhetorical choices given the rhetorical situation. So in order to do that, we started yesterday by looking at the prompt for a letter, a letter that a mother wrote to her son. We pulled apart the prompt a little bit to see what is the rhetorical situation, which elements are being made clear to us. Then we read the passage and underlined lines, phrases, sentences that really spoke to those elements. And then together we did a close study of those lines. For those of you who aren't familiar with the letter, the prompt is in the description of the video here, but I'll also tell you that I'll kind of give you the cheater tips. I'll tell you what you need to know for today's lesson. So if you haven't read it, I think it's good practice for you, but I will give you pretty much everything you need to know moving forward. So as we studied yesterday, we read the piece, we did the close reading, and we kind of came back to a few key points. That we know that the writer is Abigail Adams. She is a loving, proud mother of her son, John Quincy Adams, who is her son, that she's writing to him. The reason why she's writing is that he's traveling abroad with his father and his brother, and we know that he's traveling abroad in France, but that we also learn through the letter and some of the ways that she tries to connect with her son that he was reluctant. He was a little hesitant about going on this trip. We do get a little toward the bottom of the letter about the context, and that while he's traveling abroad, he's facing all of these challenges, specifically war and tyranny and desolation. And she says, your job is to be an eyewitness to these calamities, to understand how these things work from different perspectives. So her purpose ultimately is to convince him that, hey, even though you're having a tough time, these are valuable experiences that you should be engaging in. Because if you do, and here's where it gets to her message, then you'll be able to develop yourself and your character. You'll develop these virtues that are fitting for a hero and a statesman. So if you didn't watch yesterday, that's the Cliff Notes, the Spark Notes version of it. And we talked about how if you were to summarize all of those elements into 1 to 2 sentences, it might look something like this. Abigail Adams, a mother, wants her son, who is on a journey abroad, John Quincy Adams, to understand her views on the value of experience. She crafts a letter to her son in order to convey this position and convince him to believe it as well. There's nothing wrong with this. This is adequate. It does demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. But we did talk about how it's kind of more of a cursory look. It's more generic. It doesn't have all the nuances of the letter itself. So it was fine, but it wasn't great. And then the students yesterday were tasked with, so how can you take this and revise it to make it better? And I said, you can add some appositive phrases if you want, you can change out some words, or you can just start from scratch. And it's tough, I will say, it's tough for me to know how to help you check your sample. And I thought that the easiest way to kind of assess your learning and what you wrote yesterday is to give you 2 samples. So here we have sample B and sample C, 2 descriptions that are a little bit more developed, a little bit more complex. And I want you to, as I read them to you, think which of these best align to what you wrote. And I'm sure it will not match word for word. I mean, it shouldn't. But do you see certain elements or certain descriptions? To what extent does your description that you wrote yesterday match sample B or sample C? So sample B would be though John Quincy Adams has encountered struggles on his journey abroad, his caring mother composes her letter to reinforce that the challenges he is facing are worthwhile experiences and will benefit him. That one is so much more specific than sample A. So does yours sound like sample B, or does it sound more like sample C? Which is, while Abigail Adams acknowledges John Quincy Adams' reluctance to travel abroad, she writes a letter reinforcing that the challenges he is facing will ultimately make him a better thinker, statesman, and citizen, which is what she desires of her son. Both are pretty good. So which one best matches what you had, what you wrote yesterday? All right, let me pose something else to you. Now that you kind of evaluated or put yours side by side, I want you to think, which of these two do you think is better? Knowing that our goal is to have a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. Which of these demonstrates that? Take a moment, reread sample B and sample C, and try to judge these. Which one has a better description, a more accurate, a more nuanced description? And take about a minute to think about which one you think is better and why. All right, what do you think? Sample B or sample C? I'm hoping you all picked C. Sample B is good. I would not be upset if any of my students turned in sample B. I'd be happy with that. But when you look at them side by side, sample C is just a little bit more specific. So things like, we know that John Quincy Adams has a reluctance, whereas sample B just says he's encountering struggles. So we learn more about John Quincy Adams in sample C. We learn more about our writer, Abigail Adams, as well. In sample B, it just says she's a caring mother. But in sample C, we see that she's acknowledging his reluctance. So we see that she's a little sympathetic and that she desires her son to be a better thinker, statesman, and citizen. We get more of the purpose, we get more of the exigence. It's just a little bit more specific. Sample C is more specific than sample B. Sample C is not perfect. It still doesn't really address context, but it is, you can see that they move from pretty generic to more specific to incredibly specific by the end. So that's a review from yesterday. Again, if you weren't watching yesterday, that hopefully you have a good enough understanding to move forward. All right, so for today, we're going to build upon that knowledge of the rhetorical situation. But you'll see that I bolded it here. What we're really going to start looking at is specific examples in the text regarding syntax and diction and how those elements and how the writers perceive they influence how the writers perceive by the audience and may influence the degree to which an audience accepts the argument. So we're going to be looking more at some of those rhetorical choices. If yesterday was reading the letter as a whole and trying to determine the rhetorical situation, now we're going to start to identify which rhetorical choices, in this case specifically diction, helps to convey that argument. So now is what you might start thinking of, oh, that's what I would include in an outline for an essay. We're going to look at her language. Just to give you a little perspective before we dive into the letter, I'm assuming that you guys have talked a lot about word choice and probably beyond just your current year in school. And you've talked about how powerful words can be and how language really conveys meaning. And you might think about denotation and connotation. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, denotation is kind of like the dictionary definition. That's how I do the D and the D. The denotation is the dictionary definition. And then connotation is more about the emotions, the attitudes, the touchy-feely stuff associated with that word. So here's an example of two sentences from a released passage from the AP exam. And in the excerpt, it says, the Mississippi never lies at rest. It roils, and then talking about the Mississippi River itself, that it roils. And if you were to look at denotation, you'd maybe define that word as though it's to stir up, to disturb, to cause some disorder. But if you were to analyze this word choice for connotation, you might recognize this suggests that it's constantly moving, that the river itself is alive. Those are great ways to analyze this particular word. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fantastic. In fact, you do need to have some specifics when you're analyzing your examples. But remember, today we're focusing on the sophistication row. And our goal is to look at how the significance or the relevance of a writer's choice reflects the rhetorical situation. And if I'm only looking at denotation and connotation, I'm not addressing anything else. So think, when you're analyzing a word or a series of words, is what we'll be looking at today, think about how that relates to the rhetorical situation. And specifically, what does that example or that word or those series of words reveal about our writer, audience, exigence, purpose, message, or context? Try to think about its rhetorical function, not just what the word means, but what it means in terms of the rhetorical situation. There are many ways to develop commentary. I'm sure your teachers have given you a lot of great strategies. Again, through the lens of the rhetorical situation, some things that I would encourage you to think about after you have selected your example and you're doing a close study of those, you might go through each element of that rhetorical situation and pose questions that help you relate the example to it. So for example, you might pull out an example or start on your passage annotating an example and think, what does this example suggest about the writer's values, beliefs, or needs? Answering that would help you situate it within the rhetorical situation. For audience, you might ask yourself, what does this example suggest about the audience's values, beliefs, or needs? Or the writer's perception of these values of the audience. I also think it's incredibly important to think about, why would this be persuasive to that particular audience? Exigence might help you think through, what does this example illuminate about why the text was written? Context is, what does it illuminate about the time in which the text was written? Purpose is, how does it relate to the writer's purpose? How does it contribute to the purpose? And then ultimately the message is, how does this example relate to the writer's message? What does it illuminate about the subject or the content itself? On your handout, I gave you these questions. They're really pretty generic intentionally, so you can take it from one piece to the next. We'll be practicing it with the Abigail Adams letter, but I know that, again, you're thinking, tell me what I can do to work toward other prompts. And I think that these are some great, just generic questions to have in your back pocket, that when you are analyzing those choices, those language choices, you're thinking, how does it relate to the rhetorical situation? Try to answer these questions. All right, so let's start to practice. On the left-hand side, you'll see that I've given you the questions again. While I would consider all elements of the rhetorical situation, it's tough to do in this bizarre online setting. So we're going to focus just on 3 today. All of them would work, but just for time's sake and for efficiency, we're going to look at writer, audience, and purpose. So just a reminder, writer is, what does this example suggest about the writer's values, beliefs, or needs? What does this example suggest about the audience's values, beliefs, or needs? But also, why might this be persuasive to the audience? And then lastly, how does this example relate to the purpose? If you're following along in your handout, you'll see that I've given you the examples we'll be studying today and a chart where you can kind of fill in what you need to summarize. I believe it's a PDF. We've been struggling to figure out what type of vehicle we should give you guys resources. Should it be a Google Doc? Should it be a PDF? Bear with us, we're trying different things out. But for some of you, it might just be easier, especially if you're watching on your phone, just to take notes on a separate piece of paper. Okay, so our first excerpt is from lines 21 to 26. And it says, "It will be expected of you, my son, that as you are favored with superior advantages under the instructive eye of a tender parent, your improvement should bear some proportion to your advantages. Nothing is wanting with you but attention, diligence, and steady application. Nature has not been deficient." And we're really going to hone in on what's written in blue. Favored with superior advantages, an instructive eye of a tender parent. When you're analyzing for word choice, know that it might not be just one particular word. In some cases, it might be a series of words. And I also want to encourage you to look at it in context. So don't just look at tender parent, because if so, you might miss something that's pretty crucial. Like she's not talking about herself. In this case, she isn't saying that she's the tender parent. She's saying that while he's traveling, he's been favored with superior advantages, which speaks to his father, that his father is having an instructive eye and being a tender parent while he is there. So always try to look at the words in context. All right, I want you to take about a minute, and we'll go through this together in a second, but I want you to take about a minute to look at favored with superior advantages, an instructive eye of a tender parent, and think, what do those two things reveal about the writer, the audience, or the purpose? Take about a minute, and then we'll go over some of the answers or some things to think about. About 30 more seconds. All right, let's start to look at this. First, when it comes to the writer and what does this suggest about her values, beliefs, or needs, it tells us that she and her husband both value giving him some guidance and some support. And that they're there, they have the instructive eye of a tender parent. That both she and her husband really value supporting him, that he's not just off on his own, gallivanting in France, dealing with these struggles, but that they're trying to support him. They're trying to provide some guidance or some care for him. They want him to be successful. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that as you are favored with superior advantages, if you were to take that out of context, it might just sound like he is privileged and he gets whatever he wants. But when you look at it throughout this excerpt, it's really speaking more to that he's been giving advantages, he's been given privileges while abroad because his father is there with him. So he is currently experiencing privilege. It doesn't mean he comes from privilege. The other thing I think is interesting, at least in terms of the audience and why might it be persuasive, is personally, I would find that comforting and I would feel more confidence if I was going through some type of a struggle and a parent, my mom, I referenced my mom yesterday, if my mom reached out to me and said, you're going to be okay, you're in a safe environment, that would make me feel a lot more assured. So I would feel more confident moving forward. And then lastly, since he is going through these challenges, but favored with the superior advantages of an under the instructive eye of a tender parent, we can also see that these difficulties, while they might seem tough, they're actually pretty safe, that you should feel comfortable. So if we were to summarize all of our annotations into three key points, you might recognize that for the writer, you could jot in about how there's additional guidance or care, that yes, he is experiencing some privilege, but that's good. That's promoting some confidence in him, and that his challenges are safe. They might seem overwhelming, but they are okay for him. All right, let's look at another example. This is from the same excerpt. However, we're going to look at toward the second half of it. Again, think about the writer, the audience, and the purpose. In this moment, I want you to think more about this blue section. Nothing is wanting with you but attention, diligence, and steady application. But I want to give you a little tip first. To us today, when you hear the word want, you think of desire or something that you need in your life. However, just to make our lives difficult, in the pre-20th century text, want usually means something is lacking. So in this case, let's just break down what she's saying here. She's basically saying nothing is lacking with you but attention, diligence, and steady application. Like, you're doing okay. There's nothing that you're lacking except your attention, diligence, and steady application of these traits. So again, take about a minute. Think about why she would say that. What does that reveal about her values, beliefs, and needs? What does it reveal about him? And how does it relate to our purpose? Take about a minute. About 30 more seconds. Feel free to jot your notes down on your handout if that's helpful, or on a separate piece of paper. All right, how'd you do? Okay. I think that this is a great example, and I think that's something you might be able to relate to as a student, which means it's easier for you to analyze. So when she says nothing is lacking with you but attention, diligence, and steady application, you might notice a few things. So first, what that tells us about our writer is that she trusts in him. She believes in him. She's like, you are capable. You've got this. Nothing is lacking from you. You have all these great skills, which also speaks to our audience and what we know about John Quincy Adams, that he is a well-developed young man. He is strong and capable. The other thing you might notice, though, is by saying that nothing is wanting with you but attention, diligence, and steady application, is that maybe he gets a little off task at times. He's a little unfocused. So we learn a little bit about him and maybe his attention to detail. But by her acknowledging this, it promotes a sense of security. You know, I mean, again, I try to think about if I'm in a situation where I'm facing some difficulty and my mom reaches out and says, you know, you've got this, you're fine, you know what you're doing, you just need to focus a little bit more. I'm like, okay, I can, you're right, I can do it. So it promotes a sense of security and comfort and reassurance. And ultimately with the purpose, it helps us see that these are good. It will help him to reach his next step, to help him to be that hero and statesman. So if we were to summarize it, or again, if you are taking your notes, you might want to add these details. Conveys trust, he's capable, he just needs to focus a little bit, helps him to feel more confident again, and then he'll be able to reach his potential. All right, let's look at one more example before you're off on your own. Same 3 questions, but now a different part of the text. In lines 34 to 37, we looked at this one a little bit yesterday. She says, the habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. All history will convince you of this, of those difficulties and the benefit of contending with them, and that wisdom and penetration are the fruit of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure, and that great necessities call out great virtues. So she's basically saying here that going through these difficulties are the habits of a vigorous mind. This is what people do who are smart and intelligent. It's what they do. And that you're not going to gain from these experiences, this wisdom and penetration, if you're retired and you're leisurely or being lazy, basically, because those great necessities call out the great virtues. I want us to focus a little bit more again on her language choices, her word choice. Specifically this phrase of the fruit of experience, that wisdom and penetration are the fruit of experience. I'm going to give you a little denotation and connotation here. So I'm assuming you know what a fruit is, but I want us to think a little bit about the connotation, and that a fruit is something that provides sustenance. It's needed for growth. You might also see that the fruit of something is like the essence, the core, the basis of it. So keep that in mind, keep the denotation, the connotation in mind while you're thinking about what does this tell us about our writer, our audience, or our purpose. Again, take about a minute and then we'll go over some of the answers for you to jot in your notes. About 30 more seconds. All right. By delivering this message about challenges and difficulties, it tells us that she really values those challenges and she finds those experiences, those challenging experiences, rewarding. It's a very positive attitude. It's one that's, it's also kind of hopeful for him of here's what you can achieve if you can face these difficult challenges. So that reassures him. If we're thinking about our audience, that reassures him. This is a little redundant, I know, but it keeps bolstering him. It makes him more confident. And it also in turn will make him more optimistic that the hope is he will approach these challenges through a similar optimistic perspective. And to understand that these difficulties are a good thing. It's a positive to face these challenges. It will be the fruit of experience and will benefit him greatly. All right, so we've just looked at 3 examples, and we specifically started to look at those language choices and how a writer's choices regarding, in this case, diction, influence how the writer is perceived, so how Abigail Adams is perceived by her son. It may also influence the degree to which he accepts her argument, her advice. And we looked at the sophistication point, specifically point 1 under the decision rules and scoring notes, that you've got to think about the significance and the relevance of the writer's rhetorical choices, which we did through the given rhetorical situation. We reviewed that you can ask several generic questions for any example, any passage that might help you break down your example through that lens of the rhetorical situation. These were some of the questions we considered. We also looked a little bit at how, when you're looking at word choice, always put it in context. How does it fit into the sentence to make sure you have an accurate understanding? And then we did a close reading of those examples to develop some close reading notes. Your final homework, your task for tonight is to look at our 4th and final example. This is one we looked at yesterday. It's a great one. This is how she ends the letter. She says, "The strict and inviolable regard you have ever paid to truth," meaning like you've always been committed to truth, "gives me pleasing hopes that you will not swerve from the dictates of truth," from her dictates, "but you'll add justice, fortitude, and every manly virtue which can adorn a good citizen, do honor your country, and render your parents supremely happy, particularly your ever affectionate mother." What a great way to end. So with that, I want you to really focus on that last portion. Render your parents supremely happy, particularly your ever affectionate mother. What does that say about the writer, about the audience, and about the purpose of this letter as a whole? Try to think about that. And let me give you another clue. You might even ask yourself, one of the questions for audience is, why might this be persuasive to him? You might also ask yourself, when you get to the beginning or the end of the passage, why is it important at this time? So why is it persuasive for her to end this way? And that might be something else you think about when you're constructing your analysis. Just to give you a little sneak preview, tomorrow we'll go over this in a similar manner that we did today, where I'll give you some samples and we'll look at which one does a better job. But then tomorrow we're going to start taking our notations that you've developed today and translating that into our writing. How do you craft commentary? Like, what do you put in sentences? Right now, if you're like me, you just have a bulleted list of things for writer, audience, and purpose. So how do you take that and turn it into a body paragraph? How do you explain those choices? That's what we're going to be focusing on tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Before you cut out, I do want to give you one more announcement. The College Board, as you know, is making a lot of adjustments to the AP exam. specifically how students will access the exam and how they might be able to take it at home. And they know that some students might struggle or they might not have access to the internet. If that's you and you're trying to figure out how can you take this exam, feel free to reach out to them at cb.org/tech, and they'll be able to help you with those mobile tools or getting connectivity to help take the exam. So reach out to them if you need any support. And I hope I see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day. Thanks for coming.